Malaysia, Katrina Jorin Maliamau will be presenting the Malaysia overview, and this will be followed by a panel discussion by some of the youth activists that have been working in the civil society space in Malaysia. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to give you maybe 10 seconds to settle into your seats. I think we may be a little high on the masala tea and the good Palestinian food and the kueh mueh. Okay, everybody can hear me okay? And just a reminder that we still have translation going. If people need BM translation, please find one of my colleagues for the device. So Christina, if you want to put up your hand, BM translation, Christina will assist you. If you don't have a seat at the back, please come to the front, make yourself comfortable. There are cushions and mats, and maybe that might be easier for you. So good evening, dear esteemed guests. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your rainy evening, not Sunday, evening with us today. I know we've just listened to a really big comprehensive overview from our colleagues in London and in Lebanon and different parts of the world who are sharing about the state of human rights globally. So tomorrow, and as you were reminded repeatedly, and I'd remind you again very gently that it's embargoed until 8 a.m. tomorrow, so if you're posting or writing, do not post anything up until 8 a.m. tomorrow. We will also send you the full report in the morning, and you'll get it first thing in your inbox. So tomorrow in 70 countries, all across the world, across the continents, Amnesty International's annual The State of the World's Human Rights Report will be launched. The report, as our colleagues said, will provide a comprehensive overview on a macro level of the state of human rights globally and regionally, with a snapshot of key human rights concerns at the national level in 155 countries. In a time of increased censorship, the erasure and rewriting of history, and the cracking down on civic spaces, this project of naming and recording human rights violations around the world and claiming the world we want holds added gravity. As my colleague, the Secretary General, Agnes Kalamad, laid out for us, and as we will see very clearly in the report, 2023 witnessed horrifying consequences of escalating conflicts that have led to the near breakdown of international law. As powerful states continue to flout international law, the world has seen thousands of innocent people killed, including a horrifically high percentage of them being children, and millions displaced, leading to famine and hunger crises. The founding values of humanity enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 has been blatantly forsaken by states, undermining the very institutions designed to protect civilians and uphold human rights. We are witnessing the active erosion of human rights norms and the destruction of the scaffolding required for us to access and defend human rights. This isn't a natural outcome of the times, but the consequences of deliberate choices by those in power. All of us will be worse off for it. And as always, individuals whose rights have already been and consistently marginalized, whether it's indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, the poor, LGBTI people, will suffer the most destructive consequences. Yet, as my colleague put it, this descent into hell has not been met quietly or meekly. World over, millions of people have demanded our collective human rights be protected through protest, art, advocacy, journalism, campaigns, human rights education, films, and direct action. People all around the world have named their rights, claimed their rights, sought justice, demanded accountability, and are continuously trying to shape the world we need. This right to protest in particular has been under siege. And as our Secretary General said, and I quote, "The right to protest is critical to shining a light on abuses and on leaders' responsibilities. People have made it abundantly clear that they want human rights. The onus is on governments to show that they are listening, end quote. In Malaysia, despite the threats to freedom of expression and assembly and attacks on our civic space, Malaysians and people in Malaysia have continuously spoken up, engaged in protests, taken to social media, pressured our government through all the different ways we know how, and demanded our rights be protected. It is the onus on this government to fulfill their obligations to protect all our rights without prejudice, discrimination, and a compromise for what is most fundamental and necessary. Tonight, I'll provide a very short summary of key human rights issues in Malaysia in 2023, covering just 6 main areas: freedom of expression and assembly, migrant and refugee rights, the death penalty, torture and ill treatment, indigenous people's rights, and a right to a healthy environment. In 2023, the government failed to fulfill its own commitments to reform laws restricting the right to freedom of expression. Instead, we saw the continued use of repressive laws through the Communications and Multimedia Act, the Sedition Act, the Printing Presses and Publications Act, and provisions of the Penal Code relating to causing disunity or hatred on the grounds of religion and public fear of distress. Only one such example is the banning of the film Merdeka Terbang and the charges brought against the film's director and producer. Distressingly, the state also failed to act effectively and swiftly on death threats and intimidation levied against the filmmakers. We also saw the government ramp up efforts to censor all depictions of LGBTI representation, rights, and culture, from the absurd seizure of rainbow-themed watches to the banning of books under the guise of it being immoral content. Organizers and participants of peaceful assemblies, including the Women's March gathering and 2 separate Labour Day rallies last year, faced scrutiny and investigation by the police simply for exercising their fundamental and constitutionally guaranteed rights. The continued onslaught of harassment, discrimination, arrest and detention of migrants and refugees persisted in 2023, with little hope for improvement. In January 2023, we learned that the government deported the remaining 114 adults and children to Myanmar, where they were at risk of serious human rights violations. All 114 individuals had been subject to a legal challenge by Amnesty International Malaysia and Asylum Access Malaysia to prevent deportations to Myanmar, where the human rights crisis has only worsened. In February, we learned that 150 people, including children, died while under the custody of the Immigration Department in 2022. Yet demands for open investigations, justice and accountability have been ignored. In December, the government revealed over 12,000 people are detained in immigration detention centers across Malaysia, including 1,400 children. Although the government applauded itself for the transfer of 80 children and their parents and guardians to temporary facilities in August, where they were meant to receive more conducive care, in quotation marks, this has been criticized by human rights groups as the detention of children under any circumstances is immensely harmful. And without a human rights-centered plan for release, this plan amounts to indefinite detention, a violation under international human rights law. Despite the positive and historic abolition of the mandatory death penalty in 2023, we remain gravely concerned over the continued use of the death penalty by courts in Malaysia. This underscores the need for more legislative reforms to be swiftly introduced. Currently, Malaysia remains in the minority of countries globally that has chosen to retain the death penalty. To join the global majority, Malaysia must continue to take swift and urgent steps towards full abolition, while ensuring that the moratorium on executions is kept in place until all death sentences are commuted and until the death penalty is fully abolished. In addition to the various aspects of torture that we saw in immigration detention center and within the scope of the death penalty, We also learned in 2023 that at least 13 people, including 3 foreigners, died in police custody last year, with little remedy and justice. The Independent Police Conduct Commission Act, establishing a body to investigate police misconduct and provide oversight, came into force in October of last year. But this happened despite continuous, persistent, and overwhelming criticism of the Commission's lack of independence, as well as investigative and enforcement powers. The rights of indigenous peoples continue to be threatened and systematically infringed upon. Palm oil plantations, logging, and the construction of dams continue to threaten the land and livelihoods of indigenous peoples. In one example, in April, 7 members of the Tamil indigenous people brought a legal challenge against the government for its approval of the environmental impact assessment report of a proposed palm oil project in Rompin district in Pahang. The challenge claimed that the government had failed to take account of how the project breaches their right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment. The right to a healthy environment remains an urgent and fundamental right that is often ignored. Despite promising to finalize a plan, a national climate change bill by 2022, by the end of last year, the government last year announced that it needed still 2 to 3 more years to develop this. We don't have time to wait, and urgent action is needed. The solutions are there, but the political will is not. The above is merely a snapshot of the situation of human rights in Malaysia, and it only covers 6 areas, but each are interconnected to the full spectrum of rights and their related violations. Without freedom of expression, for example, the rights of women, the fight for economic justice, the rights of children and workers are compromised. Or as we can imagine, when the state does not have in place infrastructure for accountability, and when torture and violence persist without transparent investigations and justice, we are all made unsafe. We hope, therefore, that the summary provided in this report will enable us to connect the dots to other issues of concern in Malaysia. And my colleagues will be joined in a panel where we will expound on a few other key areas, especially relating to freedom of expression, police accountability and violence, and the death penalty. Finally, despite the false narrative of rights being distant and unachievable dreams or Western notions that those in power want us to believe, and the boundaries of borders, class, race, nationality, gender, sexuality that is imposed, we understand that the situation of rights in Malaysia sits within the global context, some of which we've just heard. What happens here is reflected elsewhere, and the struggles elsewhere are also our struggles too. As the annual report lays out, the trends in our region and globally reflect what we experience locally, and so we must read and understand it within that context. The call to action, therefore, must be for us to tackle the human rights violations in our own communities while acting in solidarity and action globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina, for that snapshot of the state of human rights in Malaysia in 2023. We'll go straight into the panel discussion now. So please reserve your questions for after the panel discussion, and Katrina will be happy to answer any questions you have. So now I'd like to invite colleagues from other civil society organizations who we've worked closely with. Janelle Tan from Suaram and Dinesh Naidu from Center for Independent Journalism, as well as our own in-house research and advocacy officer, Nicole Fong. So I think for the three people who are seated here, they might not need a lot of introduction. You might have seen them in a lot of the protests that you have attended last year, as well as this year. But in any case, Nicole Fong, as I mentioned, is our own research and advocacy officer. Dineshwara Naidu from Center for Independent Journalism. He works as the Media Monitoring and Action PO. Dineshwara Naidu is a political science graduate from the University of Malaysia, Sarawak. Extremely passionate about promoting freedom of expression. Like I said, he'll be there at every protest. And Janelle Tan is from Suara Rakyat Malaysia, Suaram, as we all might have known it. Janelle is the documentation and monitoring coordinator, who's an avid fan of depth, breadth, and frameworks. And I kid you not, she really likes frameworks and to really get into research and analysis, which I really admire about her as well. So I'm going to start off by asking all three of you the same question actually. So the three of them will be speaking about different issue areas. Nicole will be speaking about the death penalty in particular. Dinesh will be speaking about freedom of expression and assembly. Janelle Tan will be speaking about police violence and custodial deaths. So the first question that I'd like to ask all three of you is, what has been a highlight for you in 2023? And on that same vein, what has been a low light? Yes, so two questions I lied. Maybe we'll have